is a Winifred and Elizabeth Moore Distinct Professor of Ministry Guidance in the Department of Religion at Baylor University. She earned bachelor's and master's degrees in education from Baylor and a master's of religious education degree from Southwestern Seminary. She has served in church staff, youth ministries in Texas and Louisiana, and served for 20 years as a youth ministry specialist for Texas Baptist. Thank you for being here. Maddie Rosenblad has been a pastor at Meadow Oaks Baptist Church in Temple, Texas, since June 2022. She's a native of Sugar Land, Texas. She completed her Bachelor of Arts in Christian Studies degree at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor in 2017, and went on to complete her MDiv degree with a concentration in theology at Truett Seminary in 2020. She was then selected to receive the Parish Pulpit Graduate Preaching Fellowship from the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland, where she earned a Master of Theology by Research degree in 2021 with a concentration in Practical Theology and Ethics. Maddie is married to Caleb, and her husband has joined us. Dr. Emily Prevost serves as a professor of Christian ministry at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor. She loves helping students discern their calling and equipping them to follow God's call in their lives. Dr. Prevost has also served in Baptist churches in the areas of children's and college and community ministry, and worked in Texas Baptist denominational life, creating leadership development programs for students and young adults, and assisting churches in crisis. So thank you, all of you, for being here today. We are examining strategies today for preparing women for the challenges of ministry leadership. We know the roadblocks and the pitfalls. We're not going to reiterate those. We all know them. Today we want to talk about how to persevere and overcome. So, and two of these three I know, and I've heard so much about Maddie that I know that they're going to be able to give us great information and touch our hearts. So the first thing we're going to look at is discerning call. As you struggle with your call to ministry, did you have a hard time finding someone to speak with to help you work out the calling? Or were you hearing other voices telling you that you had to be wrong? And how did you overcome this? Any of you can start.
Oldest goes first. There was never a time when I walked down an aisle and professed a calling. But it was a gradual unfolding. The Beekner quote is my favorite. It was my passions, my great love and the world's great hunger that led me to the place I became aware that not only did I want to serve in ministry, but I wanted to equip. And I remember where I was in my hometown in the car at the stoplight when, as a single 22-year-old, 23-year-old, I said, Lord, I will go prepare because I'm not going to go into ministry on any man's coattails. It was a good thing I made that decision because there wasn't a man on whose coattails I was. But and there was never a problem. I made that known to my church, not by walking down an aisle, just conversationally, and they had to endorse me, I guess would have been the term. You're the registrar back now.
Church endorsement.
Endorsement, and our pastor did that at a prayer meeting, and he made the mistake of giving me the envelope to mail to the seminary. And this one, it wasn't even a pastor anyone would have known, but just like any honest, forthright person did, it was the form that I gave him where he had to check whether or not there was evidence of a call. So I just held it up to the light and said, he checked that there was not. You know, it didn't. I thought, well, I'm off the nerve. But I mean, I was going, and so I didn't know him that well, which is often the case, you know, when we're making these recommendations. So everyone that I expressed it to, I grew up in what would be considered a moderate church, and First Baptist Church, County Seat Town. anybody say what you couldn't do. So I was just going to seminary to prepare. Now I'm sure there were plenty of people that would have said, what is she doing? But I did not hear it. It's behind my back, which sometimes is perfectly fine. So the calling part was something I expressed to those around me when I came into that knowledge. And I was already, away from home anyway, so it wasn't that big a thing. But the people that mattered to me, my youth minister, other staff members, a guy named Mike Sims happened to be Minister of Education, and he was really my main cheerleader at that point of making sure I got into seminary and got that done and to move forward with that. And I have celebrated that with him just a couple of years ago with him and his wife Sheila and Jenny Pooley. You may know her, his daughter. So that was pretty much it for me.
And I always felt like along the way I had a lot of people I could process that with. I first felt a call to ministry probably around, I think I was 15 or 16, and I didn't have any ministers in my family, but my family was very supportive. My dad gave me a lot of advice about making sure I would have community wherever I went, and my mom was very supportive. She did advise me to marry rich because she was worried she was terrified of but she meant it sincerely and she was trying to be helpful. But I did always have a lot of support. My youth pastor, one of my youth pastors was a woman. She would preach on Sundays. We had female deacons in the church I was in. I remember my senior pastor would preach about women in ministry regularly. I wasn't very close to him, but when he found out that I had expressed a call to my youth pastors, he was very supportive. And even in college, I had the pastor of the church that I attended wasn't as supportive of women in ministry, but my college pastor was very supportive. And so really kind of the pastors I was closest to along the way really understood me and supported me. The faculty at my undergrad were very supportive, same at Truett. And I had students in undergrad that were good friends of mine, my peers that didn't believe that women should pastor, so sometimes I felt like I was kind of pushed to, you should be a youth pastor or a children's pastor, which are wonderful callings, but they weren't mine. And so there was sometimes some grief, I think, and some confusion around that. But even when I had people that disagreed with me and couldn't be supportive of me, I always had people that were. So I never felt isolated, and I think that's been pretty significant along the way.
I grew up in a very conservative Baptist church. And I found that people were, I too was around 15, 16 when I started really trying to discern, okay, I sense God might be calling me to do some kind of work. But for the framework I came from, people were very supportive of me becoming an international missionary. And so, it's interesting to think about. I think they were supportive in the only ways they knew how to be supported. But there were certainly a lot of internal wrangling that I feel like I had to overcome before I could accept a call, because I was like, well, women shouldn't be teaching anyone except children. And women, I'd gone to school where women couldn't pray in front of other people. And so there was just a lot of internal wrangling about even, should I express this calling? Like, is this gonna, put me on the theological heretic list? And then certainly for my family, there was a lot of confusion. I remember distinctly a very clear conversation with my mother when I changed my major to Bible, asking me if she should change. Meredith remembers this. I had a meltdown about it my freshman year. So should I mark on your form that you're life sciences or biology? They were convinced I was going to be, a science teacher still. So it really was not until I met McCry, friends that were really supportive, my faculty in my undergrad was so supportive. where I saw women, that I could even imagine that there were roles for me. Yeah.
I will mention that the gap that I experienced, that I try very hard to fill with my women students now, is that it was never mentioned to me, because I was going to be a youth minister, and it was never mentioned, have you ever considered pastoring? Now, I was never told, no, you can't pastor, but no one ever put that out before me. So I try to be very careful now with my women students. My first platform is when they say, I want to be a girls minister. I said, you don't feel like you can minister to guys and girls. Many of them grew up with a girls minister, and that's the role they want. Some of them don't feel comfortable, and so I will slit my wrist to make them comfortable with that whole concept of ministering to boys and girls. But I will also minister to mention, particularly if I feel like they have particular leadership skills, or if they're really good at teaching or with leading a class discussion, I will say, have you ever considered preaching or pastoring? Because that was never put on the table for me. Now, if I were going through that right now, I think the chances are at least 50-50 that I would go that direction. But that was never, so I had I was idyllic time of exploring my call, but the gap in the hole would be that no one ever said to me, have you ever thought about pastoring? Because certainly today, I would think about pastoring, although if I were smart, I would stay with youth ministry.
That leads exactly into my next question, which is what wisdom can you share with ministry guidance professors as they walk through this discernment discussion with female students about their call to ministry?
Keep stretching it, keep letting them know what you see in them that they could do. I heard President Livingstone spoke with my class, and she mentioned one professor that said to her in grad school or in undergrad, have you ever thought about getting a PhD? And she thought, I never thought about that. Well, look at her now. Because she always says the power of your words, that one little bit of encouragement, they will remember. Somebody thought maybe I should be a pastor. Someone thought I would be good working with children. Whatever it is. I mean, except in salary, it should be a level playing field. And I'm not saying it shouldn't in salary either, but, ministry callings are calling. So we should not say, well, if you're really called, you're going to be a pastor. No. If you're really called to work with 6-month-old babies, good for you. Please, Lord, thank you. I would say keep stretching, put options in front of them they have never considered, and let them know you see in them the potential, and if that's not your area, you have people you know that could encourage them in that area and could give them information that you cannot. So, absolutely, our discernment, just keep stretching it to their thoughts.
Yeah, and I think, kind of related to that, I think it's really important to let your female students be who they are. I think something that all people and all pastors experience, but I think a lot of women in ministry really experience, is that people put a lot of assumptions on you. I've had people assume that I was going to be too emotional for the job. I've had people assume that because I wanted to be a pastor that I was not emotional at all. To be a woman that wanted to pursue that kind of profession, I had to bury all my emotions. Neither of those things are true. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, and it probably depends on the day like the rest of us. And other assumptions that people make about your theology or your worldview. And I really think it's important to try to see your students for who they are, what their gifts are, their personalities, because the more they can be themselves in ministry, I think the more successful they'll be. I think it's a strong temptation to try to be somebody else when you pastor, and I just don't know if that ever works out well. It's just not to mean that you don't try to grow and learn as a person, but you have to do that according to who you are. And I had a lot of people along the way, especially in undergrad, I think, really encouraged me according to who I was and not try to squish me in a box. And that went a long way.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to either of you, those are, I think, both really important, is to think about, and I think I still encounter this a lot with students who are in the middle of their discernment process and don't come from a supportive environment is to help them to acknowledge the cultural challenge that you were asking of them. That though you may be incredibly supportive and the environment out there may be incredibly supportive, but in some ways you're asking them, much like a first generation student who goes to college for the first time might be walking away from acceptance within their family or their culture, or just like somebody who is expanding beyond the family dynamic or experience can be rejected, that in some ways part of what you were helping them to walk through is this process not only of walking toward, but figuring out, am I walking away? And so I think that has to be done really gently. And if we're not really careful, then some of our very best attempts to be supportive actually cause our students to push away from their various callings. And I think there's a real art to what you do in guiding discernment that I think I have benefited from. And I think sometimes the more we have seen women in ministry, we have seen women in our own experiences, it's been longer and longer that many of us been in part of churches that do support and do have women in leadership, that it is harder to remember that how disorienting it can feel for a student who is walking away from what feels like safety for them.
Thank you very much. Looking at education, what challenges did you need to overcome to get the education that serves your calling?
I already had a master's degree, so I worked a year because I needed two things. I needed money and I needed credibility. And I didn't want to be seen as somebody who was just, well, I'm going to go get a seminary degree. I've got the master's degree from Baylor. Well, let's go get another one. So I needed to establish credibility that there was really a reason that I wasn't avoiding going to work. So I worked a year, but I didn't have challenges. Now, I tell women now when they tell me sometimes what their choices are, I say, you need to go visit a class at that school. Because your welcome on that campus may not be in class what you think it is. And so don't decide you're going until you sit in a class, because you'll know if you're welcome in theological studies at that school depending on how you are received in that classroom. So, but I didn't, at that time, I was going in the late 70s and things were not mid-70s, they were not as, in many ways, they were not institutionally as deteriorated on the topic as unfortunately they are now in some segments. So I never had any animosity in theology classes. But again, I was in a track that might have been less threatening. Although there were women, Marcia Ellis, PhD, greatest doctoral people, that were outstanding women theologians getting PhDs at the time, planning to teach, but there were probably those that thought they shouldn't be teaching either. But, we had chapel speakers that talked about egalitarianism, so unbelievable that would be the case. But Boo Heflin, I still have a copy of his sermon about egalitarianism in the home and in the church. So.
I don't feel like I had many challenges getting to education. I was blessed enough to be able to have a really great education that prepared me theologically. And I felt that way all the way through. I went to Truett for seminary, so of course that was a very supportive environment for women in ministry, I felt, when I was there. And the University of Edinburgh was not, it's a school of divinity, so it wasn't really even all that, it wasn't all that denominational. I had classes with Jewish and Muslim students, and so it's just a different environment. But in undergrad, the faculty was very supportive, but I was in classes with people that didn't think I should be in those classes. And I wasn't in a ton of those. I mean, I took several ministry classes, and they were helpful, the content. But to be in a class where, there were a couple classes where I was one of like 2 women, and one of the women didn't come to class all that often. I remember texting her, asking her, please come to class. And I had a lot of very supportive male students, but the ones that were not could be rather vocal. And it didn't happen a ton, but it was a bit jarring being 20 and being told you shouldn't be in a class.
I actually said that to you.
Yeah.
Maybe they were afraid to say it to me. I hope so.
So I think one thing I would just encourage y'all with that are teaching those classes is just to be aware that if there's one woman in the class, even if she's very confident and she knows what she wants to do, she probably feels a little isolated. And that she may be getting some of those comments. She may not be. But she may be. And again, I always had really supportive people along the way. I think one thing that went a long way for me is I had a really supportive father. He always just told me, just go to class, just keep studying, and that went a long way. But yeah, you might just be aware of the fact that it might be happening.
I think the only barrier that I really experienced, and I would pray this doesn't ever happen anymore, was not until I actually got to started considering PhD programs and interviewed for a PhD program you would all know very well, and was asked as a part of my interview process, was I going to just live on canned beans the entire time that I was in the program because I wasn't married, and so I clearly wasn't going to have anyone to support me while I went through school. Sure, that doesn't happen anymore. But I think, and maybe the person thought it was a joke. But I do think there's sometimes some, the resistance came in less. It was a major shock to me because education had always been the place where I had felt so supported when I got to that interview part of the process. So I just changed my plans. Studied something different.
So what can you suggest for ministry guidance professors as they walk alongside students and teach them to advocate for themselves when they face these kind of challenges? For all of us, as we need to teach them how to advocate.
How to teach the students to advocate for themselves?
Yes.
That's tough. Because a lot of women have trouble advocating for themselves, period. And when I teach on this topic, I teach about the character qualities that are considered negative for women that are applauded for men. And I try to recognize those women in my class and encourage, just as an undercurrent, of men to do the same. But I think as professors, we need to be careful to make sure we have a level playing field and that we don't make any comments like that one. Youth ministers, we have tried to tell each other, quit saying, you're not going to make much money, because most of the youth ministers I know have been all over the world on mission trip. They take nice vacations. They have insurance. Now, not everybody does, but we tend to say things that make people think things that really are not true. So I think in the classroom, we need to make sure that the playing field is level, that we don't subconsciously play toward a strong male when there is happens to be maybe a quieter female that could possibly run circles around the guy academically or with depth of thought, that we make sure we, on a level playing field, elicit wisdom from every student in the class, not just from those always wanting to speak. And in one of my classes, we do presentations, so I make sure that some of the males are less confident, some of the women are less confident, but I just make sure to do a whole lot of encouraging and a lot of level playing field. I'm not even sure, I've got to think back on what your exact question was, how can we as ministry professors, there are a lot of things I teach them along the way, but in the classroom, I hope that's just something that's modeled. I tell them stories, absurd stories about inequalities that I present as ridiculous. How can this be? I encourage the males that if they're working in any kind of a job around women to validate their authority in their position and to make sure all the other males that are around you know that you are possibly highly likely under the authority of a woman. You know, that's life in a no, neither Jew nor Greek, male nor, I mean, that's life. So, you know, I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but the classroom is powerful by example. And we just need to make sure we have a level playing field in that classroom.
I think for me, this isn't necessarily unique to something that I want for my female students, but one of the ways that, to me, that is the strongest thing in the classroom I can do to equip them to really advocate for themselves is to become really confident in their ability to communicate clearly. And so one of the things that I do in my freshman intro to ministry course typically is begin very, very early in class by challenging the statements that they make in a way that they feel safe and that they don't feel threatened. Most of the interactions that they've had that are disagreements have not had any kind of ability or established them with a framework to have controversy with any level of civility. And so to be able to create an environment and where I can say, may I ask some questions back? Not because I don't agree with you, but because I'd like to help you get better at framing your perspective. And often in my class, we have I flip a page off the front of my podium where it says devil's advocate, and they learn that this isn't me challenging you. This is me playing a role where I'm going to play devil's advocate, and so this isn't me not liking you. This isn't me not liking your argument. This isn't me disagreeing with you. This is me helping you get better at explaining what you do. And so that practice has helped, I think, all of my students become more able to say what they need to say when challenged. I mean, when it comes to for our students and our female students who might really, their approach might have to be very different than our male students. But for them to be able to begin to advocate for themselves, I think starts with them being able to explain themselves. And so that's just a practice that I have found helpful in that environment.
Yeah, I think for me, knowing the argument has been really helpful. When I told my youth pastor that I felt called to ministry when I was 15, she printed out this huge packet for me. And it had all of both sides of the arguments about women in ministry, and it explained it in detail. And she said, you need to read this twice and then we'll talk about it. And she really made me do my homework, and I came back to her and I asked her a few more questions about it. But so from very early on, I had a egalitarian perspective of those biblical arguments. And throughout all of undergrad, that was helpful because the students that disagreed with women in ministry, they would start an argument, and I don't mean to say this to be rude, but it was just the case that they would say, you can't be a pastor because of what the Bible says. And I would say, where in the Bible? And most of the time they couldn't answer me. Or I would get a lot in undergrad, how will you be the pastor of the church if your husband is the head of the household? And I said, well, what if I don't get married? And they couldn't answer me. So I knew my side of the argument, and I continued to learn it more, and I think with greater depth and hopefully with a little more humility, but I knew the argument, and I've had a confidence, or not a confidence, that's been a steady ground for me along the way, because for a search committee, for a church, for church members that maybe are on the fence about it, especially if you're going to serve in an associate role, it's really helpful to be able to explain what you believe the Bible says about women in ministry. Because in many ways, this really is at its crux a biblical argument. It's a theological one. So I would make sure your students, male and female, they know both sides, and they know how to articulate that and have a cordial but intelligent conversation about it. I mean, it's important.
Something we did in a class, and it was an early article Meredith wrote, probably 10 or 15 years ago. It was a pro and con, not a complicated article, just listed. And I had the men in the class argue for the women, and the women argue against the women, like using your list. And so the men were having to give all the reasons why women should have everything. And just to hear them say the words and argue the points was a whole lot of fun. Most of them were in agreement, but some of them weren't. But they had to argue for the women. And it was so much fun to hear that from them. And then the women, of course, that most of them, not all, but most of them would have been egalitarian in nature. To hear them, they would almost laugh when they had to say one of the reasons why women can't, because they kind of But the fun part was hearing the men advocate from your list why women can be full in any leadership role in the church.
It's a great idea. So once you get out of school, you have to find a job. What's the biggest challenge you see for women called to ministry as they complete their education and start the search? Talk about ordination. The few positions that there are, you're competing with your friends, your other female friends. And some people needing to go.
Somebody else go first.
Yeah, I think, when I had graduated from University of Edinburgh, I really did want to pastor a church. That's really what I wanted to do. And in many ways, I knew it was because I knew it was what I was called to and what I loved. But also, I saw all of my male peers around me doing exactly what I wanted to do, which was go and pastor a small church. That had always been kind of my dream. And so that's what I was really hoping to do. And I can't tell you how many jobs I applied for. I think probably 50. It was ridiculous, and I was applying all over the world. I wasn't married at the time. I didn't need an okay at the time, so I really could just go wherever. And I think out of all of those jobs, let's just say it was 30, I think 2 were senior pastor positions. And all, around me, where I was pastoring, all my male peers, from seminary, they were going and pastoring churches. So the job pool was just really limited, and I just got remarkably lucky to go and pastor a church, and a great church. So I think that was hard, just knowing that it was limited, I think that was probably the biggest challenge. And I didn't really feel like I was competing with a lot of women that I graduated seminary from, because most of them that wanted to go pastor did leave the denomination. I have a lot of friends that are pastoring Methodist churches, and that was not their first choice. And, I had a lot of them that were really anxious about making sure they were ordained before they could go and minister. I was licensed by my home church. So I think that helped. I don't actually really know. I didn't really think about that very much. But, you know, if they're going to a church in college or maybe undergrad that's willing to at least license them, that might help them a bit.
I think in some ways, I have fulfilled such a strange collection of roles in ministry. This is a place where, for me, I feel very grateful that my calling was not ever so specific. And so I really felt a lot of freedom to fulfill my calling, even if I didn't get paid to do it, even if it had to be outside of my job. Though I was fortunate always to have a job where I felt like I could fulfill my calling. And so I just had a very different, I think for those who have a really specific calling, it is all the more challenging when you don't see open doors and you don't see support, and there are very few opportunities. And so for me, I think it has been helpful to be able to reframe that sometimes we live our calling outside of what we get paid to do, and that though that's not ideal and that's not the position I want my students to be in, I'd love for the church to always create space and support for my students to be able to follow their calling and to minister in the ways that they are called to. That for me, at least, there were always ways I could fulfill my calling, even if it was not the job I was getting paid to do. And so I think that lifted some constraints about the kind of opportunities. I mean, I hear you talking about too, you applied for 30 jobs that were not the dream job. And I think that has certainly been a part of the reality.
I want you to know I would never tell a student that their ideas on this were ridiculous. You know, because I made that comment. I would never, if a student expressed a totally complimentary to you, I would never say that's ridiculous. I've had students that were so dogmatically on that position that they would not even want to make eye contact if I were discussing women. I mean, because they were so opposed to it. Not many, but I can think of one in particular when I had Dr. Still come present my lesson on women in ministry from a biblical standpoint. And when he brought his little pamphlet of his masterful work on that topic, that student left it right there in his place. I mean, I knew exactly, I knew my course evaluations, I knew which he left that pamphlet right where I would know it was at his receipt, that I would know it was a message to me. But as far as when I'm working with students, women who are going into interviews, now this is something I did very much with my job in Texas Baptist. But even now, trying to help prepare them for what questions they would get. You know, always the question, well, how would you discipline a high school boy? I was asked that question when I interviewed, and I thought it was the oddest question. But, so I want them to be prepared to answer questions that, like, how are you going to eat? I guess you could have said, I'm going to work in a dance hall.
I didn't think this quick on my feet.
The questions like, how would you discipline the boys, or those kinds of things, that they will not think they will get those questions, but they will get those questions. So I try to help them anticipate those questions to prepare them so they won't be caught off guard. Because working where I worked denominationally, they were all over the spectrum. So, you know, people would call me for references and they did not want women. They wanted guys. And I had some classic things I would tell churches. I would say, well, you know, I don't have good friends in prison for sexual misconduct, but all the ones I know about are married men that are in prison. They're not women that are in prison. Now, there are some now. But, you know, and they're not single men. Single men have a great difficulty in church staff work, because that's my background in church staff, because they think they're gay or they're on the take with girls. They can't win either way on that issue. So, I try to prepare candidates and I try to prepare churches for what's an appropriate concern and how I would like to say I lived my life in that concern and it worked out perfectly fine. And there does not have to be failure along those lines. So I really try to prepare people going into interviews to be ready.
I will say with that, I wasn't asked a lot of questions. I felt like we're necessarily very particular to being a woman in ministry, but I have male friends in the same position. I was asked a lot of questions as to why I was single. I was asked that a lot. It's weird. Like, I don't know why you need to know that,
So I think preparing students for that is really important, because I didn't know how to answer, why I wasn't married. I just how do you answer a question like that, Anyway, it was strange.
You just say, I'm a man eater.
You just said, my mother told me to very rich and I haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping to find him in this.
Try that. Looking at analogies in ministry, and Jan touched on this, but what are the qualities and traits women should gladly exhibit that may, in our double standard world, be considered negative for a woman but positive for a man? And how can ministry guidance professors prepare females for this?
One of my favorites is assertiveness, not aggression, but assertiveness. In all walks of life, people you want to do business with are assertive because they know what they're doing. So, I try to just mention that as a quality. I don't think anyone wants to be known as aggressive. That is very negative, but assertive is fine for men, but there are unkind words for women who are assertive. And we need to help people understand that knowledge and leadership and being assertive are prized qualities for people who are secure in who they are in any walk of life. One of my good friends who's a publisher was taking his child to a birthday party, and he was the only dad there, and he didn't know the moms. And they were looking at the kids playing, and they made a comment, "Look at that bossy little girl." And he said, "That's my daughter. She's behaving just the way I want her to. She's the leader." So I tell that story in my classes because, leadership and knowing what you're doing, maybe being able to organize things could put you in a quality of being aggressive, but it's just asserting and knowing what your gifts are, what you're good at doing. So all of those good qualities, leadership, assertiveness, competency is self-threatening. There were studies in the 80s at Harvard with women in Harvard Business School who they felt like if they made a really intelligent comment in one class, they would have to go 2 or 3 class periods before they said something intelligent again because they wanted to get married one day. And they felt that the men in Harvard Business School could not take their intelligence. So just trying to create the environment where those are prized qualities for everybody to have.
Yeah, and I think, there are I think sometimes general trends with how women lead versus how men lead. I think generally women tend to lean towards maybe being a little bit more collaborative, taking their time maybe, whereas I think sometimes men it's, there's a little bit more of kind of sole decision making. But I think it's best when both gender dips into each one and it's not seen so much as being gendered, but it just fits the moment. And I think that's something I've had to figure out in pastoring is that I tend to want to take time with something, be collaborative, but every once in a while somebody needs to make a decision. And so I think to see that it doesn't, those things don't have to be gendered, even if historically or traditionally they happen in churches, but they just kind of call for the moment.
I think, and this isn't exactly what you asked, but I do think conversations where we help both our male and our female students to recognize the environment and the culture in which they operate most often, and to be able to think about their own perceptions and preconceptions around what is good or bad behavior, right or wrong behavior, gendered behavior, and particularly when it comes to leadership, what are good and bad qualities, that being able to help them to step back and think about it from a less personal perspective gives them the space to begin to imagine that there's a different way of being in the world. And then even if I choose a more traditionally masculine approach to this particular situation, that it's because it's fitting, not because it's what I'm trained that I should do, not because, not because I'm operating in a particular, that it's because I'm choosing this because it's appropriate to the context, not because it's something that I have been trained is appropriate for me as a person. I think that gets back to you, but I think having that zoomed out view helps them to imagine a little bit of the dynamic that's happening before they encounter resistance in those experiences, so that it doesn't feel personal when they encounter resistance. That doesn't mean it feels good, but it can help them to have some perspective on why is it that in the middle of this conversation I'm getting resistance as the woman trying to have this conversation, but the male colleague sitting right next to me saying the exact same thing is not getting the same resistance. It just to be able to have some perspective on what is the dynamic that's likely happening here that person might or might not even be aware of, but that influences the way that we're perceived, certainly for me was a helpful tool to have in my toolbox, even if I was going to have to, like, the right thing to do in the situation was to be more assertive, and I'm going to choose that, but I may get resistance, and to be aware that where it might be coming from was helpful.
I've never really experienced standing up for myself until I was on a church staff. And they'll kill you on a church staff. Church staff work will kill you if you don't have some sense of representing your ministry field. And I was brand new. I was probably 25 or 26, so I'd gone through all my education. But we were in a staff meeting, and there was a comment made, I'm sure by the pastors, as always the pastor, but I would think maybe the Minister of Education, that there was some disarray in one of the Sunday school rooms that took place during the Sunday night worship service. And the comment was made, well, it was the teenagers. And I guess the mother hen in me, I remember it so well because it was the first time I had ever really stood up to a group of all men. And I said, well, I certainly was not. They were with me. And so, no, there were no teenagers in the Sunday school rooms during church. They were all with me. They went to choir. We had church training. We went to church together. So, no. And after I said it, I remember kind of shaking because it was a new experience for me to do that. But that was the first time. And you learn it by doing it. So I can't expect a college student. I've had students say to me, I had one in my leadership class a couple of years ago say, well, we talk about leadership. On my campus job, a male supervisor demeaned one of the female student workers. What should I have done? I said, well, what did you do? And she said, well, I was afraid to say anything to him, but I said something to her. And I said, I think that was your best strategy, is to encourage her that she had done nothing wrong, that he was out of line, not to go head to head with the supervisor, but to encourage the person that was wrong. But, we learn by doing it. I make mistakes all the time and think, oh, I wish I had done that instead. But we have to, the case studies, I remember Bill Carroll mentioned this in last year's meeting, case studies are so good. And I use them a lot because they put you vicariously in a situation. And that's where we do a lot of group work. And then they can toss around, what would they do in this setting? And so, I'm not expecting, sometimes I don't expect people my age to know what to do. But we learn the hard way sometimes. But I didn't know at 26, but it came out when I knew that something wrong was being said and I had the right information. So.
What are a few of the inherent difficulties faced by women serving in ministry leadership of any kind? And how can you suggest ministry guidance professors prepare female students for those inherent difficulties?
I think when I graduated from undergrad, because I was going to church, I had come from a church that was supportive of women in ministry, came from a family that I thought, well, this will end here. Sexism is dead now. There's not going to be any more problems. And I think one of the things that I had to learn to deal with is that there are people that can be, in one moment, remarkably egalitarian. And then in the next breath, without even realizing it, say something deeply sexist. And it can be very hurtful. And I think I had to kind of prepare myself to face that and to not begrudge those people too long. And if I could, to explain it to them. I've had some good friends along the way where I've said, I don't think you meant to say that in a sexist way, but it was pretty, that was pretty hurtful towards me as a woman. And so I think just to prepare your students that they might come into contact with people that, or they might be in churches that are very egalitarian, but they're still going to get some comments along the way, or from people get some comments along the way, I joke about the comment with my mom, but at the time it was like, oh my gosh, now I see it, she's trying to be caring, but I think that's something that I think shocks a lot of women as they continue, is that it still carries on in its own ways, sexism does.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that if someone could have warned me that I have not yet found the right way to help students prepare for this, but when those things happen, or you're in an environment where there is an undercurrent of sexism, there is a tendency that some of us have to want to try to prove you wrong. Like if I just do my job better, and I just fulfill my role better, and I just live up to this, and that it will convince you that women really should be in these spaces. And so you can fall into a hustling for your worth role that puts you in a really dangerous situation for your own well-being. And I think it's because, especially if you walk into a place that you think is going to be really supportive, and then encounter these things that you don't quite know what to do with, or people who are exceptionally kind most of the time, and then also somehow patronizing, that it creates an interesting dynamic internally if you aren't prepared and healthy to be able to process some of those things.
So the question was, what are the inherent difficulties?
Yes, what are a few of the inherent difficulties faced by women serving in ministry of any kind?
One that I think is pervasive is authority. I don't like the word power. Power can be grabbed. I like to tell my youth ministers, you have an area of authority. Now, if all the parents like you and they happen to be on all the big committees at the church, you may have some power, but don't you dare grab it. Stay in your lane of authority, but I tell people, when you're working, and I say this to the guys, I said, if you're serving on a church staff and you have a female, your behavior, your words, and your actions need to recognize her authority in front of other people. Not just privately, but if you hear someone say something negative, you can say, well, she has the authority to do that. The church called her to do that. And I think authority is a kinder word. Maybe we use power a lot because we're forced to look at it. But when you're called to a position and you have authority to make decisions, then it's an inherent difficulty if somebody's talking behind your back as if you don't have that authority. So I think we need to make sure everyone is willing to recognize everyone's authority. On a church staff, you need to have women, even if they're not preaching, they may not even want to be preaching, but you need to be validating their ministry in the church to the entire church by having them on the platform, by having them do things to everybody. So it won't be that they're pigeonholed in an age-graded ministry, but they're ministers to the entire church, and their expertise happens to be in this children or youth or missions or whatever it is. So the difficulty is the lack of respect. And some people will never be convinced no matter how well you do. But a whole lot of people will be convinced, because when your colleagues are validating what you're called to do, what the church is asking you to do, and that you're doing it well, it will help to soften some of those that thought you shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. And there are plenty of those. But one of my students told me, and this broke my heart, that at one of our Christian camps, a big one, that a woman, a college student, had asked one of her, she was in charge of this, but she asked a young man if he could get all the trash taken out, and he refused to do it. And he said to his friend, she's not going to tell me what to do. And the guy, much to his credit, said, that's her job to tell you what to do. She's the head of this team. You're supposed to take that out. She asked you to do it. But it brought my heart to think that in 2023 at Christian camps we would have a young man that would refuse to do something his team leader asked him to do. So that tells me there's a real problem with authority. But then lots of people have problems with authority of all kinds. But it's really easy to see it in the gender sphere. And it's really, but we can work on that. And we can, just like we can validate, as older people, I can validate the authority of someone younger than I am. And say, well, that's their thing. So it's not always a gendered issue, but we're talking about gendered issues today.
One thing I've experienced, especially when I do denominational or kind of local things, is that I'm oftentimes the only woman in the room. And that's fine most of the time, because usually I'm in an environment where the men are supportive. I'm most of the time treated like I'm supposed to be there, you know. But I think just sometimes the repetitiveness of being the only woman in the room, and at least feeling like I kind of stick out like a sore thumb. I may or may not, but I feel that way. Sometimes it makes me want to kind of not do those things, and I'll say I'm not going to that meeting today. And my first year of ministry, I had a lot of guilt about that, but now it's just, you only have so many hours in a week. But now I just kind of think, okay, if going to all these meetings this week is going to wear me out because I'm the only woman there, I'm not going to do all of them, and that's fine. And to encourage more women to come if you can.
Would you be willing to take questions from the group?
I want to add one thing on that. I try to encourage women not to work against their femaleness. If I'm going into a deacon's meeting and a deacon makes a comment, well, our room sure looks better now, I'm not going to take offense to that and say, well, I belong here. I'm not here to, but they're paying me a compliment. So I tell them to not borrow trouble, to take offense when 70-year-old man may make a comment that to him is gracious and say, this is the best our committee has lived in years. Well, thank you. I'm glad to get to serve. You know, I don't need to take offense. Don't need to take offense to that. Now, I do, another thing, if there's a guy on the church staff and I just got back from a trip and they say, let me go vacuum out the van. You think I'm going to say, oh, no. I'm going to say, great, go right ahead. And they may be doing it out of being gallant, thinking, you know, I'll do this for her. And that's fine. I'm not going to fight that. I'm also not going to complain if they say, will you take some minutes of the meeting? Or if they say, will you make the coffee? I said, I've never had coffee. I don't know how to make it. Or if they say, will you bring the cookies? I said, well, I'll do just what you'll do. I'll go to the store and get them. You know, you could do that. But I try, you know, I tell people don't borrow offense when oftentimes it's not meant to be offensive. I laugh with Delvin Atchison, who I adore, and he made the comment one day in a meeting, crying like a girl. I said, what is it? Crying like a girl. And we laughed about it. But that goes to show there are colloquialisms we use that we really don't need to use. But he was not being unkind in any way, and I was laughing as I called him out on it, and he knew it. And he still laughs about that. So, but we don't need to take, I tell them not to be prickly. They're women, and they don't need to overcompensate and think, I'm going to prove this to them. But I also tell them they are held to a standard that's unfair. I say, if you mess up being a youth minister, they will say, we're never going to call another girl in that position. I said, now, a guy messes up, they're never going to say, well, we're never going to call another man. No. But if a woman messes up, they will say, we will never put another woman in that position because you are a standard bearer. So, you know, but that's also a privilege. And I don't think it has to be burdensome. It can be sometimes, but it's also a privilege. So,
And if we don't stand and be the only woman or the first, then someday we won't be the first one.
Yeah.
Someday it'll be normal for the woman to be in there. But we have to be the first in order for someday it to be normal.
yes, that's right. But we don't need to be, I tell the women, don't be prickly about every little thing.
Can I just add to that? I hear what you're saying, Jane, and I think that there are some women who it does make them feel objectified, and like their value in the room is reduced to their appearance, which doesn't get said to the men. And that then it can add up to become this emotional baggage that they carry, kind of like being the only woman in the room for so long, that then that does affect their ability to step into the room with confidence and to lead. And so I think for some, I think giving folks the agency, where for you it doesn't bother, absolutely, you know, laugh with folks if that makes them comfortable, but if it makes someone uncomfortable, that they have the autonomy to say, I actually, you kind of said it that way, you didn't mean it this way, but that makes me feel like my leadership is being demeaned in this place and is a subject of how you view me as a woman.
I think that's very
finding
fair.
that point of agency, because it is an objectification, but yes, you can absolutely choose how you respond in that moment, and one response that is also valid is to say, that's not appropriate here.
I think that's very fair, and I do think some of it is like you were saying, kind of how you're feeling that day. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's very fair.
Are there any questions that you'd like to ask?
In this context, I'd like to make a comment or two. I came to Hardin-Simmons in 1981, and we had maybe 2 or 3 young lady students who were thinking about ministry. And basically they were wanting to take classes in the area of religious education because that was more palatable at that time. Susan Day was a student and she was considering ministry. She was actually a music major, I think, at the beginning, but then she eventually, through one of our professors, switched over to the Bible. She was also my student secretary for a while, and that was about it. But there's something else I want to bring in with my comment here because it relates to the Baptist world, so to speak. We had the representative from the BGCT come to our campus to talk to us about what we call the ministerial grant, the money that ministry students would receive. Dr. Fletcher, our president, was in the meeting, and I and the other faculty were in that meeting. And the BGCT representative, at that time, his thinking was the BGCT was only for pastors, which of course meant it was only for men students. Dr. Fletcher responded, he always was very diplomatic and had a way with words, but he made it clear that Hardin-Simmons was going to have the ministerial grant open to a student who had a call in the ministry, which I was the one administering that at HSU, and that's the way we did it. Well, that had money talks, and money, in a way, I think, kind of helped, wasn't the only thing, but it kind of helped open the door for female students to apply for the ministerial grant. And we were glad to do it. I encouraged the young lady students to present that proposal to their pastor so that they could get church certification on it. And that began to unfold and develop. And so over the years, from the 1980s forward, that began to increase in the sense of women students, not girl students, women students, to be there and apply for the ministerial grant in part, but beyond that, to major in our area and be accepted. And it's kind of emotional to talk about it, but we have two young ladies, I still call them young, two young ladies in our group right here who are the product of that changing culture, Emily and Meredith. And the other statement I would footnote on that, once this began to develop, some of our best students were the women. They had better research skills, they were more organized, they were more prepared, better read, better communicators, and God had given them the personality and the capacity to do ministry. So basically what I'm trying to do is say, yes, the struggles and questions and obstacles are still there, and I'm sure they will always be there. But I'm grateful for the progress that has developed. So don't give up. Like Winston Churchill said, never, 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 never give up.
That's good that you have living proof you can find it.
Thank you.
I oversee field education at Church Seminary the last couple of years. This is anecdotal, but I feel like I've had several conversations with women students, and they, when we begin to talk about where they might do their mentoring, they kind of put their hands up at the thought of local church ministry, and they talk about church hurt and fear, And, I always tell all the students, I'm not the Holy Spirit. I'm not trying to direct you. We're trying to discover where the Spirit is leading you. And yet there's also, part of me that, I want more and more and more pastors, men and women, to take positions in local churches. I have that bias, maybe. I wonder what you would say to women who express something similar.
I think it's pretty important to go through an intentional process where you process that hurt. I think that, I didn't really have a lot of hurt. I was really blessed in that, much more than a lot of other women in ministry. But I had to go through my own process. And the best advice I got was go through it, but don't stay in it. And so I had to be real intentional about processing negative comments that I got, comments that people didn't mean to be sexist, but added up, and so I needed to work through that. But I will say, it was all worth it because, I became a pastor, and that's where, sure, you still deal with challenges and you still deal with challenges particular to your gender, but the joy of pastoring way outweighs that. And it's again, I don't have a lot of pain and I don't have a lot of church hurt, but it's healed a lot of those wounds because I've been in an environment where I get to do ministry and I get to work with church members in the ministry of the church. And so I really try to encourage women that there are churches that they're not going to be perfect because no church is, but you can find a church where you can follow your dream. And so I think it's both. I think it's processing, but don't let them lose hope. That there really are churches where you can do the thing that you've wanted to do since you were 15, 16.
That's good.
So, yeah.
I was a student in 1988 at Hardin-Simmons, and I want to echo Dr. Hancock's comment about women in class because Dr. Fletcher was an incredibly difficult professor, and he graded on the curve. And I just want to thank the women in the class for ruining the curve. If they had not been there, I would have gotten a better grade. That was always, the reputation of the women at Hardin-Simmons was always, we knew when we had women in class that I don't think many of the students dared question that because they were always representing well and was prepared and academically, like you said, running circles around the guys sometimes. So anyway, just wanted to piggyback on Dr. Hancock.
Larry, I tell my students that church staff work is the most emotionally expensive work they can do because I believe that to be true. That every day in and out. So, I tell them if God's calling them that I believe there's a place for them to serve. Now, it could be in Virginia. I think I told Brooke Holloway that one time. But letting them know there's a place, but that it is emotionally very expensive because you are living life with people, and that there are going to be tears. You'll weep and you'll rejoice. That's just part of it. But then again, you're walking. So if you're called to walk alongside people in life, to be their theological guides, then that's what you're going to get. So, but when I don't have many that want to go into church staff work, but when I do, that is really exciting, and I tell them that. But I agree when we need more of them, because this other thing, sometimes I say, well, I might want to do nonprofit. I'll say, well, describe that to me. Well, I don't know. But church staff, they've grown up in a church, so they kind of have an idea of what that might be. But it's not for the faint of heart. I doubt I'll ever do anything as difficult as yours being on a church staff.
Can I say something to you, Larry, too? I'm Jennifer. Hi. I do emails, but you don't know me. I have students like this too in undergrad, and I have to also gauge when to honor their personalities and their experiences as well. And so 'cause I'm one of these people who left the state, left the church to go into academia, and in order to, because of my personality, I wasn't going to go straight into ministry, even though I felt called into it. And so there are people like me who have to take the loopholes sometimes. And so I think there's a real discerning process for those of us who are leading them and guiding them to say, like, there are some people who can do it, who have the personalities to just push through and be straight into church ministry. But there are some of us that are going to take different paths. And, those paths are good.
Absolutely.
Too. Yeah.
Good word.
And I think we need to remember that much of the resistance could come from male students as opposed to the pastors, the male pastors and professors. I recall when I was at seminary at Southwestern, one day a girl came to me very upset that a fellow male student had said to her, because she was going for the MDA, that the student said, I don't understand how any woman would go for an MD. Why do they do that? And she was just so upset. And within that year, she dropped out of the MD program. She dropped out of seminary. Okay. We need to prepare the male students too, even as we prepare the female students for this the place that we in the church as well as in the kingdom in essence. In general, we have a place for any man and for any woman.
I would like to kind of follow that up with just a question as a professor who's taught ministry a long time. What can we, and I'm as a male professor, what can we do? And I appreciate, the words that a lot of our institutions that are represented here are very affirming of women. But it is a cultural issue. Our students are coming from all different kinds of churches, and a lot of our male students and our female students are coming out of complementarian, deeply complementarian situations. And I've always struggled with, how direct do I be in, I kind of wait for that moment in the semester where we're going to deal with that issue. But it seems to me what I'm hearing some of you say is that, maybe we need to be doing something pretty early about respecting one another in terms of life choice. You don't have to agree, but, what do you think? What can we do more as educators to level the playing field, not to necessarily push my egalitarianism, but to at least get a kind of change of atmosphere, of respect, where this kind of thing, because that goes on and we don't see it. Faculty are the last people to, I'm always surprised when it comes time for one of our female students to graduate and they're going to go to, an institution that's complementarian, and you just want to say, what are you thinking? But it happens all the time. And of course it happens with our male students too, that they go to an institution, you go, I thought we taught you better than that, But, it's such a frustrating thing, but is there something we can do kind of early on, or whatever, to create at least respect? What would you say?
This is not the answer to your question, but it might give you all a little more hope that what you do really is making a difference. This has been probably 5 years ago. I had 2 students in my class that were about to graduate and get married and go to a seminary. He was going to a seminary that was definitely complementarian, and neither of them were supportive of women in leadership roles in the church, and they had both taken 3 or 4 classes with me. And when the male student of the 2 of them was ordained, asked me to come to his service, and the day before they graduated said, hey, when I get to fill in the blank, name of the place, if I'm upset about something or I'm really confused, do you mind if I call you?
Wow.
And so, you know, if you'd asked him, he didn't believe I should be in leadership. He didn't believe I should be teaching. He didn't believe I could be ordained, and he definitely didn't think I could preach. But he was willing to submit to my authority when it came to the difficult things in his life. And sometimes, like, culture just gets in the way. And so, again, not answering your question, but on the day that we all want to shake our head and think, what are you doing? I do actually think that lives are being changed.
Yeah. That's good. Let me mention something else that makes a difference, and that is you all, ladies, making a difference where you are and being a role model. Amen. To take it away from you all, my wife is from southeast Georgia. She lives a mile from the Baptist church on the one hand of her farm place and a mile from the Methodist church on the other end of her farm place, and her family goes both places. The Methodist church, to take it out of Baptist world, we're never ever going to have a male pastor until they couldn't find one because the church is small, they needed bivocational or something. When they had a lady, and she came and did a dynamite job, they said, we need one every time. And that's the kind of role models, that's the kind of role models we need, and y'all are that. Thank you.
I wonder if it wouldn't just help to just, at the start of the semester, kind of have rules for class decorum. And, you know, I think, I'm not a theological educator, so you would all have a better sense of me than this. I get the sense that that has gotten worse over time. May not, but just kind of basic, how do students speak to one another? How do they respect their professor? You know, and so I think it might just be helpful to start off the semester with these are the rules for decorum. And you might just acknowledge that they're not going to agree, and this is probably one of the big areas they're not going to agree on. One of the best conversations I had in undergrad was with a friend of mine that grew up in and was in a church that was very complementarian. And when we just kind of stated where we both were coming from, we could have a conversation. But sometimes I think that with students that I disagreed with, even some of my good friends, we couldn't say it. You know, it's like if you don't say it out loud, then it's not a real thing, but then it would subconsciously come out and you would argue about it in not nice ways. So I think maybe just putting it out in the open might help, and just starting off the semester with that way, especially if you're in a class where you think it's going to come up, maybe in particularly ministry classes. So I don't know, but I just wonder if just putting it out there would.
So that person didn't think you should be teaching. I'm still.
I know, right? I'm still hung.
It's crazy.
And I like that suggestion.
So one of the things for me that has helped me, regardless, and I was at Southwestern for 11 years, even during the bad years, the worst years. And I was always the only woman in the room. But the thing that helped was I was settled in my call. I knew that my call came from God. And when I was settled in my call, it didn't matter what anybody said to me about anything because I knew God called me and I answered to Him. So getting to the point where, you know, you can talk about your call and understand this is my call. And if you all don't think it is, that's fine. I still have to do what God tells me to do. Gave me the strength to be in a room full of people that half agreed with me but couldn't talk about it, and the other half thought I was crazy, and why aren't you taking notes or getting our coffee? So really, I think for our students, when we can help them talk about it and work it out and think about it and pray about it and become settled in the fact that God called me to do this, and I'm going to move forward with what God called me to do regardless of who's against me. Because even for our male students, they're going to come up against some people that say, you're not any good at this, why are you doing this? Well, because God called me to do it, and I'm going to continue to try to get better because God called me to do it. And in the rough times, male or female, we need to remember that this is a calling from God, even in the rough times, so I'm not going to quit. So for me, that's what's helped me. It may not help everybody, but it's helped me.
I would have to acknowledge there's sexism in a lot of occupations.
Exactly.
And I know a young woman that finished at Rice, chemical engineering degree, and it was months before she got a job because the paradigm was the chemical engineer goes out onto the oil rigs and out in the field, and this was just a little petite young woman, and she was female, and I got a degree from Rice, and she had a lot of discouragement. So it happens in other areas and in other fields. And I read a Hardy Clemens story years ago that when his grandchildren came to visit him in Lubbock, that one of them got sick, so he took them to the doctor, to the pediatrician. And it was a male, and the male pediatrician walked in, and he looked at that doctor and said, I didn't know a man could be a doctor. Great. Because his experience was only a woman had been one. I love that because it's all about, and I tell women that don't think they would want a woman pastor, I'd say, I just really think that's tradition, not theology. I think you just haven't seen a woman pastor. And I think if you saw a woman pastor, you would be fine. I don't think it's theology, I think it's tradition. So.
And I think that's the real joy about, for me at least, going into ministry, is that I don't feel like when I get up on Sundays to preach or lead the church that I'm their female pastor.
Yeah.
I'm just their pastor at this point. It's not, not my gender's divorced from me, it's still a part of me, but it doesn't take center stage anymore,
You get amens from Pete all the time.
Yeah, what's the story with Pete too? When he first called Lily and he said, I'm not going to mow the parsonage, and then the first Sunday she was there, he was out there mowing the parsonage.
One thing I was thinking about too, Bill, is early on in our semester in our ministry class, we talk about Baptist principles and freedom of conscience. And sometimes when we're talking about women in ministry, we'll have one of the students will say, how is it that we believe in freedom of conscience, but you can't allow a woman to discern a call to ministry? And I said, that's a very good question. Why is that true in some circles? And so sometimes just kind of coming back to that too, that also is a good grounds for classroom discussion and disagreement, that we won't all come to the same conclusions, even with our devotion to Scripture and our desire to, be faithful to God. But that's part of where we identify freedom of conscience, that's something to discern before the Lord. And when I talk with my class about that, I talk a little bit about, if you go to a church that talks about women's roles being limited, and they tell you, oh, we might be wrong, because this happened, there's like local counter programming in one of our churches where they were like deliberately educating our college students against what we were teaching them in our classes. And I was like, if they say, we might be wrong, does that work out? Can you discern a call to ministry there? And they'll listen and say, you are free to discern that? Because if they might be wrong, you ought to be able to come to a different conclusion. But if they won't support you, they don't really believe they could be wrong. There needs to be like hands off if they're just not convinced. So, but I try to
really like
remind them.
the way you put that. That's something I can take away from today, is that I think, like Maddie said, I think a lot of things come back to theology, and starting a class with some theological principles about what are our most fundamental beliefs, and talking about liberty of conscience. There needs to be some premise that students begin to buy into that gives them permission to change their points of view. And I really think that's a very helpful insight.
Well, I want to thank all of you for serving today with us, and thank all of you for your great questions and just